I am honored to welcome Lola Milholland, author of Group Living and Other Recipes, to this edition of Fox Chats. To kick us off, Lola, what's your elevator pitch for Group Living and Other Recipes?
I'm so excited to be here. And I think of the book as having three primary threads. The first is that it's a memoir about my experiences with group living. And then the second is that it's an exploration of group living through the stories of people in my life. So looking at my mom, looking at my aunt and uncle, looking at the people who I live with. And then the third is that it's kind of an explosion of group living as a metaphor for interconnection.
So, Lola, what are some of the benefits of group living, and are there any downsides?
On a very simple level, I think there's practical benefits to group living. So you can share rent. We're living in a time of extraordinary housing inequity. Group living isn't the solution to that, but it is a tactic for survival. Those things help us live lighter on the land. They also can be time saving. Having someone buy groceries and not have to go yourself. If you go out of town, having someone who can feed your cat. These kind of simple, practical things that sort of reverberate throughout our lives. But I think the primary benefit of group living is what happens with camaraderie across time. So the kind of intimacy that you can build with a group of people and the way that that intimacy challenges you, forces you to be accountable for your mistakes, forces you to ask other people to be accountable for theirs, gives you someone to talk to when you're trying to process the world and your own life. These kinds of feedback loops, they give us strength and they help us walk through the world and feel more at home. So as for downsides, I think the most obvious ones that people think of are you don't have as much control of your own space.
Mm-hmm.
You go home and it's not all the things you want on your wall. It's not all the food that you want in your refrigerator. And also, if group living is a way to avoid loneliness, the opposite is also true. You may not have enough time alone. We think of home as a refuge where we can just like get in our pajamas, lie on the couch, be sloppy, eat things we don't want people to see us eating. But there's actually a benefit to having someone witness you do that too and feeling comfortable and safe doing that. Sometimes we want camaraderie in that too.
And can you talk a little bit about what intentional living looks like in different settings? You talk a little bit about that in your book. You talk about Japan and then your aunt and uncle's community in Washington. How are they similar and how do they differ, kind of depending on where you are in that experience?
Um, After writing this book, I realized that I think about communal living settings in terms of government structures. So, so like in Japan, I lived there in college. I lived with a mom and her two grown daughters, both of them older than me. And I would describe it as a benevolent matriarchal dictatorship.
I love
So
that.
really like loving, caring, the rules were clear, power was very clear, the everything was structured. It was very loving and we all knew how to operate within it because there were no gray areas. Okay, now you look at my aunt and uncles, they have co-housing community in Port Townsend, Washington, and it's a form of democracy. And
Mhm.
like early US democracy, it's for land owning people. So it's a limited democracy, but it's highly bureaucratic, intensely oriented around how decisions are made, very process driven, hugely time consuming. It really is for people who want to practice leadership, decision making, kind of a collective organizing. And so they are both living together in that way and also operating their community in that way. And then if you look at my household, it's an anarchy. It's an anarchy. And the power structures are always in flux. Luckily, we are good at that. I feel like there's a little more chaos, but there's also a little bit more leniency.
Mhm.
And it allows us to have a form of chaos that means people can come and go. And we're very fluid with it. We're very comfortable with it. But so I'm sure there are many other forms of group living than those, but all of them hold a couple things in common. So I think no matter which form you're in, you have to reckon with how decisions are made.
And can you share a story about an interesting guest who spent time at the Holman house?
For my dad, it was the Tibetan monks who I write about in the opening of the book. And for my mom, it was Wendell Berry, who's a huge hero for her and who stayed with
Hmm.
us. But for me, when I think about it, the person who came to mind was this performance artist named Fred Nemo. He lives in Portland now. He's quite old. He has a bookstore. But he never lived with us. But when my roommate Cynthia was living with us, he would come and go from the house fluidly, like he was like the neighbor in a sitcom. And one day I came home to seemingly to an empty house. And I got there. And at that time, my roommate Cynthia and all her friends had knit this beautiful sculpture they called the Woolen Man. It had all the bones and muscles of like a Body Worlds exhibit feature, but it was all made out of yarn. And I arrived at my house, and Fred Nemo was dancing around my house alone, all in black, and he had pinned the Woolen Man to himself. And he had that song, I think it's called You Sexy Thing, but it's like, I believe in miracles, playing. And he was dancing around my house. And then I got there and he was like, would you record me doing this? So I like video recorded him moving through my entire home, like in and out of my bedroom, in and out of the bathroom, dancing with the Woolen Man, singing like as that song played. It was just like a moment in time, but it's something that I loved. It made me feel like he felt at home in the house. And so that was what came to my mind.